should Christians be effective altruists? What are effective altruists? And what are some objections to this view? All of these questions will be discussed in this video. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm delighted to be joined by JD Bauman. He is the director at Effective Altruism for Christians. And he seemed like the perfect guy to bring on to talk about this movement, what it is, and how it applies to Christians. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, really good to be here.
All right. So first, let me back up. Before you get into what effective altruism is, maybe how did you get involved in being the director for this organization, like the path that led you here? I'm sure that's a long story. Maybe you can just give us the brief summary.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I grew up in a Christian family, missionary family. We were a bit abnormal by worldly standards because, like many missionary families, we didn't have a salary. My dad didn't have a salary for like 25 years. So we depended completely on donations, support from friends and family and fellow churches to fund my dad's work. And so I kind of grew up with this sense of everything I have belongs to God, and we're just stewarding what we have. And we also have to trust and rely on God and on the generosity of others to really get by. And I grew up thinking, I'd either become a missionary myself or help fund those who are. And as I went to university and learned about all the good things you can do in the world, I realized it's not just missions. There's lots of other good things you can do. And eventually I heard about this thing called effective altruism, which we can talk about, I guess, for the next bit here. But I realized it's a really, in many ways radical, but in many ways ancient and classic way of viewing charity and doing charity well.
Yeah. Okay. So what is effective altruism?
Great. So effective altruism, it is two things. First, it's an idea, and second, it's a movement or community. The basic idea is pretty simple. It's about using reason and evidence to find the very best ways to do good, and then to take action on that basis. And it's formed into this actually quite sizable movement of maybe a few tens of thousands of people around the world who take this idea really seriously. Research institutes, organizations, nonprofits, individuals at university, philosophers especially, and who try to apply it. I guess in practical terms, a lot of effective altruists or people in effective altruism give away a lot of their money, many 10%, many much more than 10%. A lot of effective altruists or people in effective altruism or EA, they pursue careers intentionally because of impact. They think this particular path that they might be on is especially impactful, and they might prioritize impact or effectiveness over passion or over personal interest. And a lot of it is about being calculating and not just doing good, but thinking really hard and running the numbers and doing whatever seems to have the greatest impact on the margin.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into whether Christians should be effective altruists or not, I recall reading a book and doing an interview with Dr. Paul Blaschko at the University of Notre Dame. I don't know if you're familiar with the book that he wrote. It's called The Good Life Method. And so he himself is a virtue ethicist, but he interacts a lot in the book with consequentialism. And one of the chapters is on charitable giving. And I think in that chapter, if I recall, he talks about a student of
Peter Singer.
Peter Singer.
One of the
I knew it was
thinkers,
Peter.
you could say.
Right. Yeah. I don't know any other time I could think of his name. Okay, Peter Singer. Yes. So the reason I mentioned this, a second ago, you said, not only like charitably giving, but even your life decisions can, like you want to be calculating in maybe what career you pursue so that you can have the greatest impact. And I recall in that chapter, I don't know if you're familiar with this story or not, there was a guy that was Peter Singer's, I guess he was like a student. I think he was an undergrad at the time. He was really he had a lot of potential. He was a really good philosopher, and he could have easily gone on and gotten a PhD in philosophy. but instead he chose to become like, I guess, I forgot what the career was, but whatever career it was, he made lots more money. And he even though he wanted to be a philosopher and get a PhD, he went with that so that he could make more money so that he could give it charitably. Is any of this ringing a bell? Am I?
Yeah, that's a very common path that many people in EA take. Even the path I took. So I wanted to study philosophy. In fact, I learned more about the amount of good that I could do through my donations. It cost just about $5,000 to save somebody's life, donated to an effective charity. I realized, wow, that's an incredible amount of good I could do. And I felt a bit bad studying philosophy when I could study economics and probably command a higher wage after I graduate. And so I switched to economics, and that's a very common path. And so it's also very related, right? So I think EAs will see a situation like that where you could make a life change that is a small sacrifice to you, but just makes a massive impact for somebody else. And they'll say, that's the life change that you should make.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting. I hope I didn't take too long to tell that story. You told yours much faster and made the same point. So that's cool. Okay.
And I think there are a couple of I'm happy to go where you want to go with this, but I think there's even some more like deep underlying philosophical assumptions that are made.
I wanted to ask you about
altruism.
I wanted you to say, what is altruism and what's the effective part doing before we move on?
That's good. And if you hear some whining in the background, my puppy is here. She's watching the interview, and I'll bring her on for a little bit. But if she's too unruly, I'll have to take her out.
Oh.
But actually, she's a good point for one part of altruism, which is this idea of impartiality. This idea that altruism should be good not just for you and for me, but for people outside of our normal circle of concern, including strangers we've never met, including people on the other side of the world, including animals in many cases. Like Chloe, my dog, is a wonderful puppy. I love her very much. Everybody loves their dogs. But we often don't care as much about dogs we've never seen or that are strays in another country, or animals on factory farms. They're kind of outside of our circle of concern. And so a key principle of effective altruism is this idea of impartiality, that we shouldn't be partial just to our dogs because they happen to be our dogs, but we should treat beings, especially people, but including animals, we should treat them equally, regardless of sort of if they're in our backyard. So it's kind of a critique of that idea of charity. Maybe somewhat of a critique of that idea of charity begins at home. So impartiality is one key idea of that altruism. Another idea is this idea of welfare, that what's good for someone is what we should count, not maybe overly abstract or esoteric ideals of what is beautiful or what is orderly, but instead we should care about people's subjective experiences, and we should try to promote happiness and promote joy and flourishing. And so the altruism is definitely about impartiality. It's definitely about welfarism. It's also maximizing. So this gets into the effectiveness part. Effective altruists would say that if you have the ability to help people, you shouldn't just take an action that helps one person, but all else equal, you should take a similar action that helps as many people as possible. So if there's a burning building and there's one person in one room that's burning down and 10 people in another room that's burning down, all else equal, you should save the people in the room with 10. You should save all 10 of them. So it's maximizing. And it's also like truth seeking. It's trying to be rational about these decisions. So that's all kind of some of the underlying points that most people mean when they're talking about effective altruism.
Earlier, my wife asked me, what interview are you going to be doing? She saw that it popped up, there's going to be an interview this evening. And I said, oh, well, it's going to be on effective altruism. So she said, what's that? And I said, well, maybe I can explain it by example. That might be most helpful. And I gave this example of you could donate money toward a seeing eye dog. So this dog would help people who are blind. And I think if I remember correctly, I might be overestimating, but I thought the number on that was $65,000 for every dog that you train to do this. That's the amount of money. Whereas there's like there's other blind people in the world that a $20 surgery can allow them to see. And the effective altruist wants to say, well, we can have a way more impact. We can help way more people if we direct our giving toward that $20 surgery rather than giving out lots of money for a seeing eye dog.
Yes.
Do you want to comment on that example? Or
Absolutely. There's this charity in the UK. It's called Guide Dogs, and they do a great thing. They help people with seeing disabilities get a dog that helps them see, a sightseeing dog. And this is estimated by charities in this space to cost something like $65,000 to train each guide dog. You have to get the trainer, and you have to get it approved and licensed. And dogs are a lot of work, as you can tell, and quite expensive. And it's a great thing, but it's just very expensive. And there are also thousands of people who suffer from something called trachoma, which is this condition where their eyelids will grow inwards, and it will scratch their eye to the point where it will scratch their cornea and eventually cause blindness. And we know the cost to treat trachoma costs something between $20 and $40 per patient. And there are still people who need guide dogs, and there are still people suffering from trachoma. And the question is, which should you do? You know, if you're going to donate money, should you donate to help one more seeing eye dog, or should you donate to help hundreds, perhaps thousands of people suffering from trachoma to see again? And I think there we could say quite unequivocally, both charities are good, but one choice looks much better.
Hopefully people the viewers have a sense of, I get what effective altruism is saying. I understand the idea now. Now I wanted to shift to the question of, should Christians be effective altruists? Is it okay if we go ahead and move to that question?
Yes, and that's really where my specialty is. I didn't come up with these ideas of effective altruism. So I lead a community of Christians who are in the effective altruism movement, who think these ideas really mesh well with what Scripture tells us, with what Christ shows us in his life. And we think this is really a great tool to help us better love and serve others as Christians. So I guess I'm very happy to transition there, and I'm very bullish on the intersection with Christian faith.
Yes. Okay. So what would you, obviously I'm a Christian, so you can try to persuade me, but also many of my viewers will be as well. So what would you say to Christians to try and get them to say, you know what? Yeah, I think effective altruism is the way to these ideas. Like, this is how we make decisions on where we give our money.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would mention a few just facts about the world. I would mention that we know as Christians from the fall that the world was broken, that sin has marred our relationships with God, with ourselves, with others, and with all of creation. And so it just happens to be that there's tremendous need, but it's not just that the need is tremendous. It's also that even the ways we try to help those in need oftentimes fail. So I don't know, Jordan, have you read the book When Helping Hurts by Brian Fikkard?
Sections of it, not the whole thing from start to finish, but yes, I'm aware of that book.
Yeah, good book. Many Christians have read it. So we read in the book that Brian, he grew up in a missionary family where he thought that something he was doing to help the beneficiaries of the charity he was involved with was actually helping them, but actually it was hurting them. It was creating dependency. Not to bring up this classic example, but many people know of Tom's Shoes and how they distributed shoes in the Caribbean, and they did it in a way that just like shocked the supply of the native shoe market. And this actually did more harm than good. It cost many jobs, and this is actually really, really bad thing. And this is kind of what happens when we don't take altruism seriously or try to aim to do it effectively. And we know that that's like actually something that can happen whenever we try to do good. So, our best intentions, we know this in our personal relationships too, right? Like our best intentions don't always lead to the flourishing of somebody else. So I think Christians really understand this key point, and I think we've lived this and experienced this in many points. But that is actually like a very, very important point in charity today. There are just millions of charities that exist. Many of them don't work at all. Some of them actually hurt. And so I think it's a part of good stewardship to make sure that when we're giving in a way that we know helps, and ideally in a way that helps the most. And I think that's important because every person matters to God. We mentioned people suffering from blindness earlier. God doesn't just care about the person who is in a wealthier country who can afford a seeing eye dog. God cares just as much about the many thousands who are suffering from trachoma in much more neglected areas, people who are suffering with much less resources to help themselves. We know God cares especially for them. So I think the fact that every person matters to God, and the fact that many ways we try to help don't actually help, it should really point us to be really, really shrewd about how we can help most.
Okay. So as you said that, I had various objections that come to mind, but before I move to like objections, and there's kind of like two levels of the objections. You can object to effective altruism in general, and then you can object to like the kinds of reasons that might appeal to Christians being effective altruists. But before I do that, do you want to say anything else about why Christians should be effective altruism, or try to effective altruists to try and motivate them to do this?
Yeah, I'll mention one last thing. So I think touching on these other points of effective altruism, it's not just that traditional charity is quite ineffective. It's also that we as Christians have arguably the best reason to help others, and in very radical ways. We have a God who came in the flesh and who died for us, and who calls us to love others as he loved us, who gave his life. He gave everything he had for us. At the very least, we can love others and do that quite radically, actually. I mean, and I'm reminded of just like the fact that we as Christians, especially in wealthy Western countries, we have so much we can give. Jesus says that where your treasure is, there your heart is also. So I think this idea of altruism shouldn't be like second nature to Christians. In fact, calling it altruism is a bit of a funny word, right? We know from 1 John that we love because Christ first loved us. And so we don't have to create a concept or for love. It's a natural response. And I think we also see in Jesus this like radical impartiality as well, not just helping the other, but also helping the other who it's hard to love. So we might think of helping a stranger or somebody living in a foreign country as a really hard thing. But we see in the story of the Good Samaritan, we see that who God says, essentially Jesus is asked about how to love and whom to love. And Jesus says, who is the better neighbor, right? And he gives this story of somebody who helps a complete stranger, in fact, an enemy. And I think in the same way, we in our modern society can help strangers living in countries far and away, and we can help them much more effectively oftentimes than people in our own backyard by giving globally.
You put in the notes here about Peter Singer's. Well, we've mentioned Peter Singer once, and now I just mentioned him again. It might be worthwhile to pause for a moment and say more about Peter Singer and maybe his influence on this movement that is effective altruism.
Sure. So Peter Singer is a philosopher. You can love him or hate him. I know many Christians don't love him, maybe not as much as we should as Christians, but we take issue with the fact that he, as an ethicist, has some controversial views towards animals, towards the unborn. But shelving that aside for a second, he has this really good thought experiment. And he says, imagine you are walking home from work one day. Actually, imagine it's somebody else. Imagine someone's walking home from work one day and they're wearing a very expensive suit, and they walk by a pond, and it's a cold fall day, and they look out over the pond and they see some splashing, and they know that the splashing, it's not a fish, and there shouldn't be anyone swimming because it's a cold day. They realize it's a child. It's a child drowning. And and they know it's a shallow pond, so they could just jump in the pond and pull the child up and save the child. But they realize, it would cost their suit. Their suit would be ruined. And so they decide to not save the child, and they decide to just continue on their way and walk home. And so the question is, would you save the child? And I think for many of us, the obvious response is yes, I would save the child. I would do this. But the fact of the matter is, we every day are presented with a very similar situation. In fact, the same situation as this. We don't walk physically in front of somebody who's drowning on any given day, but we are living in a world where about 5 million children die every year from preventable causes under the age of 6. About 5 million children die each year. We know it costs roughly the price of an expensive suit to save these children. And yet we all go on buying things we don't need. We all go on vacations we could probably do without. And that's just a very, very sad thing. And I think the fact that a non-Christian philosopher points that out before Christians start to listen is actually a very troubling sign. But I think this intuition here is deeply consistent with the kind of love we see in the Good Samaritan, in the kind of love we see in Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if it's okay now, can we shift to maybe some objections?
Let's do it.
Okay. So but you gave a list, and before I jump into your list, I may mention just some of the objections that come to mind based on the things you said in the past few minutes. So you mentioned the book When Helping Hurts, and you gave the example of Tom's shoes, and in that example,
they've gotten a lot better, by the way. So they've kind of turned around. They've learned from their mistakes, but many people are familiar, so that's why I mentioned them.
Right. Yeah, and I don't mean that as in let's hate on them or something like. That's an example that people are familiar with, and in that case, at least initially when they first started this stuff, it hurt people rather than help. You might say it did more harm than good. Okay, so I understand in that example, we would say, okay, in that case, like, don't give to things that you know are going to do more harm than good. I think most people are going to get on board with that. But now, say you've got two cases where in both cases, we're doing more good than harm. Maybe we're just let's make it simple. There's no harm. We're just doing good here. But one has maybe more people are impacted. I'm not getting to the objection yet. I'm just wanting clarification here. What are some of the factors that go into deciding, what the most effective route's going to be? Is it solely based on like numbers of people? So,
right.
you
But
mentioned
number of lives saved or something.
Yeah. Is that the sole, I guess, consequence that we're looking for here?
No, that's a good question. So no, it's not. And I think that's a really good point and a good criticism, because oftentimes we're at risk of making goodness a little too simple, or just reducing it to maybe like simply hedonic pleasure. There are people who think that goodness is just maximizing utils. But I don't think if you're an effective altruist or someone in effective altruism, you're committed to that view. Some do have that view. You're not committed to it. As Christians, we know that many things are good. So happiness is a good thing. But we can think of instances where it's maybe a bit harder to measure well-being for someone, or instances where we might be less happy, but we find more meaning or more joy. And so some of these things are hard to measure. I think we still can measure many of these things. And I know many Christians who are really leading the charge with measuring these things well. And I think we should applaud that. We should really try to be diligent and be really discerning about how to measure these things well. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, we are left with some kind of triage situation where, whether implicitly or explicitly, we are deciding between many different options with our charity. There's over 1 million charities out there. We could just give to wherever it feels good, or give to wherever it feels natural. We say, it's doing good on net. It's doing good. But oftentimes the problem is there's another charity or church or nonprofit that's doing that work, but even better. And we could be helping more people if we found that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you
And I
want to
think the way
say,
to think of it is maybe if you are that person, if you, maybe we could say both things are good. Giving to the average charity and giving to the best charity, they're both good things. But if you think of it from the context of the person who's suffering, whether they're suffering from loss of meaning or they're dying of malaria, for them it's actually quite bad if you choose to just give to the average charity, because there is somebody out there who will in effect suffer if you don't choose the best charity.
mm-hmm.
And eventually you'll suffer if you think about these questions too long. So maybe there is an optimal stopping point, but
Right. That's
yeah.
a good point. Yes. Yeah, it gets really complex. So I just didn't, before raising like more particular objections, and like I said, this isn't so much an objection as is just a question. What factors is one considering when deciding? So it sounds like obviously, if you're faced between giving to a charity where like lives are not at risk, and by giving to that, you're not going to be giving, or you're going to be giving less to a charity that where lives are at risk. It seems like effective
you have to make
altruism
these
is
trade-offs between lives and helping in other ways. Yeah.
well. It sounds like effective the way you're describing it. When lives are at risk, I don't know. I was going to say when lives are at risk, that's the kind of charity to give to, rather than one where it's like lives aren't at risk. And I'm thinking lives of humans here. So it's like, if it's like I can give to a charity that picks up trash around my city or something. Okay. Versus like I can give to a charity that, would save 100 lives of children under the age of 6. Well, it sounds like you're going to say, go for the one that's going to save those lives, versus like, don't get me wrong, picking up trash is
shocker.
very important.
I think that's probably right. And I think that's right. I think this is a criticism some people have of effective altruism, is it forces you to make these really hard-nosed decisions about who to help and how not to help. And it almost presumes that there's a clear-cut answer, like you should always save lives, when that's in fact not what effective altruists say. There are many cases where maybe you should aim to improve lives, maybe, for instance, help people who are blind to see again, rather than to save lives. But effective altruists are really acute in pointing out that we make these trade-offs whenever we spend our resources. There's a limited sum of resources we have. In a Christian sense, we've been entrusted with a certain amount of wealth to steward. We can't use this money in an infinite amount of ways. We can either fund our local trash cleanup, or we can fund to save a life from malaria. And the question there is, where do we draw the line? And I think that's something we pray as Christians. We pray about. We ask for discernment. But I think right now, it just is the case that we've really neglected people who have been suffering in far off places for far too long. The fact that it only costs a few $1,000s to save somebody's life is something that I was shocked about. I didn't believe this. I didn't believe this when I first got into this movement. But I've been researching and asking economists for years and looking into the public health data and talking to including all the Christian experts I know. And it just is a fact. It just is true. So we know reliably, also through charity evaluators like GiveWell and others, that on average, it does cost so little to save a life. And so that really does mean that whatever we spend on anything else, we're kind of diverting from those causes. And we have to decide when that's right, when that's not right. So effective altruists are also very demanding. Peter Singer especially will say you should give up into the point where it costs you just as much to give up that extra resource as it benefits somebody else to receive that resource. So he would say, while there are people dying of malaria, that we can help for a few $1,000s, you should give of yourself up until you are suffering as much as the person you would help with your resource. And so it's a very demanding version, right? And I think there's a part in me as a Christian who sees the cross and knows that, Jesus said, whoever asks you to go with him 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Jesus, who tells you to bear your own cross, Jesus, who gave everything, his own life. I do see a certain demandingness in what Jesus tells us. And I think Peter's onto something, even if it's not so true that we should give up everything and sacrifice our families. And right, like there's maybe a cutoff and there are key relationships we should honor, but maybe it is actually very radical and we should be doing incredible amount more for the poor and the suffering.
Yeah. Okay. This was going to lead to one of my objections. And then I promise I want to get into the list. The list you have is great. I was just, while I have you here, I thought I'd go ahead and ask you some of mine. Okay. So you touched on something right there with relationships. So I have a 3-year-old son, and God forbid he develops some type of, illness that looks fatal. And I'm faced with the decision of I could give like let's say it's $25,000 or something like that. So it's like it's going to cost me $25,000 for a surgery to save his life, or I could use that $25,000 to save the lives of a lot of other people. What's the effective altruist going to tell me to do in that case?
That's a great question. So the effective altruist, or people in effective altruism, there's a lot of grace and humility I find with people discussing these things. We're all trying to help. So of course, if that were to happen to anybody, I think there'd just be a tremendous amount of understanding and sympathy, right? As a Christian, I'll speak for myself. As a Christian, I do think I have duties to particular key relationships in my life. Maybe to my puppy, but probably not my puppy. But to my wife, to my parents, to my siblings. So if something were to happen to them, I do feel a particular duty to meet their needs first. That being said, I think there are a lot of services, and there's a lot of provision for us, especially in higher income countries. I don't think I'll ever be in a situation where my wife has to choose between my life and the life of somebody in another country. And I pray nobody else has to make that choice. But I think if you're in that choice where it's really life or death for your nearest and dearest, I think that's a tough call. And in times of war, people make these trade-offs where they'll actually leave their family to fight to save their country. And I think sometimes we forget that life can be really demanding, and tough calls can be made, and tough things can be asked of us. And I think effective altruists are right in noticing that we are essentially always in wartime. There's always somebody who is going to suffer if we don't step in and help. And we can't just excuse ourselves from that just because we're shielded by natural barriers, by geography. I can't just ignore the plight of the 600 million people living under $2 a day because I happen to live in a country where most people earn $60,000 a year, right? And everything connected with that. So I think that's a really hard decision, and I wouldn't judge anybody who decided to save their family. In fact, I'd probably commend that. So.
Yeah, I didn't mean to put you in the hot seat there, but that would be a very difficult situation, and my intuition would be I've got to save my son.
Oh, but we live in this country where we've taken this kernel of truth and we've just expanded it into this massive distraction or falsehood. And I think the kernel of truth here is that we have individuals in our lives to whom we have these holy and sacred duties, right? But what we see is that Christians in the US actually give almost only to others in the US. Christians in general only give about 2 or 3% of our income. And churches in general only spend a couple of % of their revenue on global missions, on global service. This means that, the average Christian is spending barely, if that, pennies on the dollar for people who are living in the deepest need in other countries. And so I think we've actually we really distorted this idea of caring for those near and dear, because we've stretched it too far, I think. I mean, because it's not just our local community we should care about. Absolutely, we should care about them, but we should care about people suffering on the other side of the world, right? They are just as much God's children, and we can nowadays, by God's grace, help them in just as many effective ways, if not more. In fact, because they're so in need that it's actually very hard to help somebody who's homeless or in trouble in the U.S. because we have so many social services to help them already. But somebody who's living on $2 a day and who can't put a roof, literally put anything above a thatched roof over their head, who can't provide food for their children, who cannot vaccinate their children for things like measles or just everyday things. I mean, these are really solvable problems that we can solve right now in a heartbeat by donating to Give Well charities. And so many of us just prefer to help our already well-off communities, frankly.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. In my situation, it can kind of go to the extreme, but you're allowing room for, hey, there's going to be certain relationships that you do have a duty toward, but that come first. But let's be honest, you probably have the kind of people watching these videos are probably able to give more, and they just need to reflect carefully on what they're doing with the income that they do have room. Okay. One thing,
if you're watching at this point, I'd really challenge you to take a pledge to give. So an effective altruism isn't just about giving. I think a lot of people in the community would probably be upset with me for not talking more about careers, because many think that actually the way that you choose to spend your time in your career is even more impactful than your giving. But I think we all kind of start with this intuition that we can give more effectively and then we can update our career. But I think almost all of us, and if you're watching this video, probably you too, can take a pledge to give 10% of our income to the most effective charities. And I think we can do this above and beyond our tithe as well. So, and that's a tricky thing we need to discern. And, when is it the case that giving locally is our duty, and when is it ineffective compared to what we can do globally? That's a hard thing, but I think we should all be thinking about that.
One last thing on this note. If you go for this radical impartiality.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You're just as impartial to your wife and your son as you are to anybody else, because, hey, God loves them all equally. It sounds like, I guess, I don't know, there are verses where Jesus is like, you got to hate your mother, your father, blah, blah, blah. So somebody might come along and say, well, look what Jesus said. But probably many Christians are going to have that sense of, okay, we're not going on that full radical kind of impartiality there. There is going to be partiality towards your wife, your son.
Right. And, 1 Timothy 5:8, if anyone doesn't provide for his own, then he's worse than an unbeliever, right? So you do have these calls, if you will, in scripture to care for your immediate relatives. That's right. And I think the philosophical or the deontological term for this would be a side constraint. There are certain...
Yes.
You can have an otherwise quite consequentialist ethical theory, but have side constraints or specific duties towards individuals.
Yes. Okay.
Is a part of what we're called to do.
Right. Okay. I'm going to go with your objections now that you sent in advance. We haven't talked about...
quick funny thing about this. So I made this video online about the best criticisms of effective altruism. And in fact, it's my best performing video. I don't have many followers. If anybody's watching, you can follow me if you want. I'd be very honored. But it's actually my best performing video, which I don't know what that says about me or about effective altruism, that the criticism gets the most praise.
I will make sure that I link that video in the description. So go watch it and it'll get even more views. One thing that I'm interested to talk about, I don't claim at this point that these are the best objections, but they're just ones that are of interest to me. with what little bit of background I had to effective altruism before doing this interview, one of the things that comes up is not just the problems that we face now and how we can help solve these problems, but we have to try and anticipate what future problems might arise and be proactive in preventing those. So can you maybe mention what some of these kind of long-term problems might be, and what effective altruists are doing now to try and solve those problems?
Yeah, good. And this is related to the impartiality point. So if you think that all lives are equal, regardless of geography, where someone happens to be born, well, you might also think that all lives are equal no matter when they're born. So you wouldn't think that like your grandmother has a lower moral status than you do because she happened to be born, 50 years before you or whatever. And in the same way, you shouldn't. It might be kind of strange to think that your grandchildren or your son has a worse moral status than you, or better, because he's going to come after. And so this brings up this idea of, do we have duties, or should we try to promote the welfare of people who come after us? And when you do the math, you actually notice that based on current population growth trends, and assuming that world doesn't end, most of the people who will ever exist will exist ahead of us. They'll exist in the future by a wide margin, in fact. So many researchers think that that we'll have many tens, hundreds, maybe thousands or more times people in the future than we have today. And so if you really want to promote what's best for them, or best for the world in general, you have to look to them and what's good for them. So that might look like many different things. And the idea that we should, promoting the welfare of future generations, that this is a moral priority of our time, a key moral priority, that is called long-termism. And then the idea, there's this related idea, but it takes it a degree further. And it's this idea of strong long-termism, that the only thing, like the overwhelming moral factor in our actions, is how it impacts the long-term generations, the long-term future. And so a considerable chunk of people in the effective altruism movement take this long-termism or strong long-termism view. And it leads to things like trying to prevent an asteroid from hitting the Earth, or trying to work to reduce conflict with a nuclear arms exchange, or trying to prevent misaligned or malicious artificial intelligence from taking over and taking control of the nuclear weapon systems, right? And so, in fact, somebody who's an effective altruist, who's a strong long-termist, might say, we shouldn't give to malaria nets to save the life of someone in Africa. And we certainly shouldn't help someone in our neighborhood. We should actually promote research and fund research for preventing the next asteroid strike, right? And so it actually becomes very abstract in actually a very cerebral way of doing good. And this is important, of course, because if you actually prevent an extinction, you've essentially saved the billions or trillions of lives that come after that extinction point. And so, these are big numbers, lots of zeros we're dealing with here. So that's actually a criticism of many people. They say this is actually very counterintuitive and can be manipulated in many ways.
Okay, I know we're approaching the end of the video here. We probably have time to mention one more objection before I wanted to ask you a couple of final questions. One about what charities to give to, and maybe another about what careers might be most effective, I guess. So before we go to that, do you want to mention any other pressing objection, maybe one?
Yeah, that's right.
That comes up a lot.
So the one that comes up the most is actually this idea that EA is too utilitarian, that it's focusing on the wrong idea of what welfare is, and it's prioritizing that at the costs of our near and dear. And I think we talked about this earlier, kind of why we should maybe on the margin care more about people who don't live in our neighborhoods, and how we can do more good that way. But and how we have duties to our family. But maybe some have this idea that yes, that we don't see in Scripture commands to help as many people as possible. We don't see essentially this. I think many people would say that this idea of helping strangers is like quite counterintuitive, and that moral duties don't work that way. And maybe the best critique from this perspective is like maybe some kind of Christian contextual critique that says that like God has placed us in individual communities for a reason, and that this isn't just some kind of accident of our birth, but that we were somehow placed here, and that we have some kind of duty associated with our providential circumstance. And the community God has surrounded us with. But, to this, I just say, well, God has put you in a world where there is somebody suffering in sub-Saharan Africa that you can help by giving to a GiveWell charity. Like, you can save their life for a few $1,000s, right? So you are just as much providentially here for that act of kindness as you are for the act of kindness in your own neighborhood. So, so I don't have much sympathy for that criticism, but I think you kind of have to wrestle with like, what was God thinking, right? And I think it comes down to the problem of evil again. Like, what was God thinking in creating a world where many people do die of preventable diseases? And I think that's something we all wrestle with as Christians. And you do a great job on your channel, bringing on hosts or bring on guests who talk about that and different theodicies. But at the end of the day, we have to point the question at ourselves. And why am I, JD, not giving more to help? Why am I not making greater sacrifices to help? And immediately it's a humbling question. It's not an objection at God. It's a confession, right? And I know I have so much more I can do. And I have so much more work to do and to grow with God's grace to be more generous. So
I sincerely hope that if you've watched the interview so far, you feel like maybe a little convicted. Like, yeah, I could be doing more. JD's issued a challenge that you need to make a commitment to try and give more.
And not just give more, but give effectively. Give to, because there is this big difference in charity impact. So, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Very helpful clarification. Give effectively. So maybe to finish out the interview, maybe you could mention like 1, 2, maybe 3 charities that you think these are really effective or very likely effective for you. I get that it's going to be very person relative, like, well, given your circumstances, and other things, but maybe your typical person that's going to watch this video, what might be effective charities for them to give to?
Yeah, that's great. We mentioned lives, not because lives are the only thing that matter, quality of life matters, but I think everybody can acknowledge that like the loss of a child under 5 from malaria is a great tragedy. We should all care if that happens in the world, and we can prevent that for about $5,000 or $6,000 by giving to the Against Malaria Foundation. If you are more interested in preventing blindness or sight loss, the charity that treats trachoma, one of them is Sight Savers, and it costs about $30, $40 to reverse, completely cure and reverse progressing blindness. So Sight Savers is a great one. You can prevent children from developing parasitic worms that reduce their appetite and steal from their brain power. Schistosomiasis, among other parasitic worms in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in rural Kenya. You can help that through the SCIF Foundation, Schistosomiasis Control Initiative Foundation. And there you can treat a child for a year for about $1, a little over $1. And we know all of these statistics, and we know that they work reliably, and we know that they're going to work for you if you donate, because evaluators like GiveWell, that's GiveWell, one word, have done in-depth analyses, tens of thousands of hours of research into this, and are just the gold standard for measuring impact. Also, some people are talking about discipleship-making movements and church planting movements as an interesting way to spread the gospel among indigenous believers in South Asia. That you can fund church planters for the cost of 1/100th of your pastor's yearly salary in the U.S. So that's an interesting trade-off. Think, do I fund more local churches, or do I actually support churches that have much less means? So No particular names there, but something to be looking for. But yeah, it was really good sharing about these. And I don't think these are the only effective charities. I think there's a lot of effective charities, but if you don't know where to give, these are great. I think top choices. Give well. If you have to give to a Christian charity in name, then Compassion is recommended. And yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to look into this. We have a lot on this about. We have a lot about this on our website at www.eaforchristians.org. We also are launching soon a website for careers, helping Christians to discern a career that has a greater impact. Because so many of us are just kind of asking, what, especially in our late teens and 20s, like, what is the career where I can have the greatest impact for God's kingdom? And I don't know who's really offering that advice. So we have undertaken the task of providing that advice. And hopefully it will help many people. So I don't want to mention it just yet, but if you go to our website, you'll find a link to that probably whenever you're watching this video.
That was going to be my last question, but I'll just let viewers go and check that out, because as you mentioned a moment ago, it's not just about giving your money. You can be effective in what career you pick, which sets you up, puts you in a kind of situation where you're able to be even more effective than you are possibly now. Okay, well, I've really enjoyed doing this interview with you, JD, and getting to talk with you. And I definitely appreciate you mentioning those charities at the end. So you talked about Against Malaria, Sight Savers, SCIF. So these are purely secular, but doing great good. And then Compassion.
And Christians working there, in fact, at these charities and doing good work there. And one thing I'll mention, if you're a Christian and you want to advance the gospel, in fact, if somebody dies at the age of 5, I don't know if they can really live a full gospel-driven life, right? If someone dies, before they can ever really make their faith their own, have they really lived life in relationship with God? And I think there's even a Christian case a very strong Christian case, spiritual case to care for helping those with material needs. So
right. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me. I am definitely going to be giving toward these organizations, so thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. And I love the show. Great job.
All right. Thank you all for watching. And after I release this video, I do plan to release an interview that I did with Dr. Eric Sampson, where he presents a kind of dilemma for effective altruism, but it's based on the afterlife. So this is more on the intellectual side, but do check out that interview. I think if you enjoyed this one, you'll be interested in hearing that as well. So thank you for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.